doulas. I'm here to talk to you today about the second stage. I had a client recently message me and say, hey, I've just been doing some research and I'm just trying to understand the difference between open glottis and closed glottis pushing. And, those are terms that we learn as Lamaze childbirth educators. But it was definitely interesting to hear that coming from a client. Obviously, they're doing a deep dive into that research. And I can see how it can be a little bit confusing. I personally, as a doula, having done this work for 20 years, don't have a lot of pet peeves, but I have a couple, and you can guess one of them is around coached pushing. And I don't mean giving people a little bit of guidance who have a really dense epidural and are having trouble, feeling what's going on. I'm talking about that hardcore coached pushing where everyone's yelling at the birthing person and they're telling them to push harder, 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 harder. One of the comments I hear often is push like you're mad at your baby. Push like you're mad at your baby, or push like you're having a bowel movement. Listen, folks, I don't need to pull out the anatomy chart to show you where babies are coming out of, but it ain't your bum hole, right? It's not your face either, which is what people end up trying to look like they're trying to take lift off like a rocket ship in their face, right? When we're doing that really hardcore coached pushing. So first of all, what does research tell us about pushing in general? And, so I'm going to include a bunch of different links and you can peruse through that. What we know is that historically, if we look at birth art, it's unusual for people to instinctively choose, especially a lay back on their back position for pushing. That is not an intuitive position for most people. Sure, if you're tired, maybe leaning back, maybe more commonly is probably lying on your side, or probably most commonly hands and knees or a squat position, right? That's probably what a lot of people would get into intuitively. So why did we end up in this semi-reclined position on our back? And I want to bring us back to when birth first came into hospitals. So we're going back about 100 years now. It's hard to imagine, but in the year 1900, almost all births happened at home, right? 90% is the approximate percentage of babies that were born in a home environment. 10% were born in the hospital at the turn of the last century. And so it's been a really big change in a short period of time when you think about the history of mankind, right? When birth came into hospital, and of course, what were the reasons that they said birth would be better in a hospital? Well, one of the things was access to medication that helped people to forget their birth. And that drug, of course, many of you know, referred to as twilight sleep or scopolamine. And scopolamine is an amnesiant, right? So scopolamine doesn't actually take away our pain. What it does is it gives us amnesia from the experience. And so people who were under the effects of twilight sleep or scopolamine were actually really pretty out of it, and they flailed about quite a bit. But what happened after the birth is that they forgot about all of that stuff. And so the person's memory seemed better about their birth experience. Now we know that a lot of people had poor reactions, both birthing people and babies had poor reactions to scopolamine as a medication, and it got discontinued within a couple of decades for the most part. Many of you might have grandmothers or great grandmothers who say that they had that well into the 50s. And I've even heard people tell me into the 60s, but we knew it was bad for us a lot longer than before that, right? Anyway, if you are out of it in your birth, how would you get your baby out? Right? How would you get your baby out? And so because people would flail about so much, people were often restrained to the hospital bed. Their legs were put into stirrups. They probably got episiotomies, and forceps were used quite commonly at that time because people were not participants in their birth experience. So all of this, you're like, Stephanie, this is a depressing topic. Yep. So that's the history of how we probably ended up so much on our backs. And the thing about medical practice is when we get used to doing something a certain way, it really becomes quite difficult for us to shift that around. Research tells us that it can take about 17 years on average for us to change medical practice when we know better. When we know better, it still takes 17 years. So here we are in the year 20 whatever, And I know the year, but I want this video to last other years. So I don't want to say the year. You know what I'm talking about. And we still see people pushing in that semi-reclined position. Now, of course, there are many, many wonderful caregivers who let people push, I hate that term, push in whatever position they feel like getting into. Specifically, we see that in midwifery model of care, and of course, wonderful, wonderful obstetricians who also facilitate upright positions for birth. And we know that all the hospital beds are made for squatting bars, right? If you pull back a little corner and you see a hole like that, what do you think that's for? It's not for a flag, right? It's for a squatting bar. The squatting bar goes in, right? So I sometimes, I'm at a birth and my client want to use upright position, and I jokingly say to the nurse, like, hey, Nurse Shelley, can we like dust off the squatting bar and bring it in here? Because it's used so infrequently in many places. So that's squatting. That's where we are today. And so what I really, really cannot stand is this thing, right? Where people are in this semi-reclined position and the caregiver says, okay, grab behind your thighs, put your chin to your chest, curl your back like a C, take a big, 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 big breath in and push. Right? And then what happens, right? Person starts pushing in their face, right? They go like this. Gosh, have you ever seen that? Broken blood vessels here beside their nose or in their eyeballs? It's horrible. It's so horrible. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. And then just so much intensity, people just yelling at the pregnant person. It just seems so intense to me. As a doula, listen, it's not my job to say stop doing that, right? I can advocate for that at a boardroom table, and I talk about these things all the time to anyone who will listen to me. In the birthing room, I sit there at the top beside my client's head, and I just sit there very calmly saying, there you go. That's it. Listen to your body, just like that. Amazing. That's it. There, right. Amazing. So bring the calm. And I've had many, many clients say, I didn't hear any of the other chaos. All I heard was your calm voice in my ear. And so that is how I'm going to show up. I'm also going to provide a lot of information and education on the difference between closed glottis and open glottis pushing. So those of you who've been fortunate enough to be at a birth where no one told the laboring person how to push, what happens, right? Well, sometimes there's a little bit of reaction to that, where we're going through transition, and all of a sudden maybe there's a little bit of a lull, and all of a sudden the person starts to feel that intense sensation to push. And at first it's a little bit startling for a lot of people, right? They're just like, oh, like, what do I do with that? Oh, that sensation, like, oh, it's so intense, it's so intense. But then they start to get the hang of it. And what maybe someone says, hey, if you feel like pushing, just give it a little push. And they do a little push, little push. And then what? Starts to feel better, right? 90% of people say it feels good to push. 90%. And yet that's what so many people are afraid of. They're afraid of the pushing phase. And 90% of people say it feels good to push, because now instead of a contraction coming and we have to just sort of surrender to it, we actually get to work with it. And that feels good for a lot of people. And so when people who push of their own instinct, what they often do is little pushes, little pushes, little pushes, little pushes, right? They will often get into a more upright position. And listen, I'm not even going to pull out the pelvic anatomy thing, my pelvic model right here to show you, as a doula, it makes no sense for us to sit on our sacrum and press our sacrum. It condenses our pelvic outlet. It condenses that space. Our baby has to defy gravity by trying to come up over the tailbone and under the pubic bone. It makes no logical sense. We need to encourage people to get into different positions that feel good for them in the pushing stage, especially for a first-time birthing person in the early part of second stage. They should be probably in an upright position or whatever is intuitive to them. Of course, people will always pick what is best for their baby's positioning if they are connected with their intuition and their instincts, right? That will always be the right position. But we could definitely talk about it prenatally. We can encourage it, okay? So what is closed glottis pushing? Back to our topic. Closed glottis, this is our glottis. Closed glottis is holding our breath. My glottis is closed. Open glottis pushing, here's what we see. You see those pushes, those little pushes, they tend to not be as long as when we hold our breath, right? But research tells us they're pretty much just as effective, right? And I would venture to say that someone who is unmedicated, so who doesn't have an epidural, who is listening to their body, who is choosing their position and choosing the sound, the breath, and whatever they want, that their pushing stage will be more effective than if they were coached. Now, of course, so you're saying, Stephanie, all of my clients get epidurals. We have high epidural rate. Sure. Of course, we don't perceive things the same way with an epidural. Now listen, modern day epidurals meant to take away pain, but allow the sensation of pressure to remain for the second stage, right? Great, that's great. And I see a really big difference between the epidurals of when I first started in this line of work to the epidurals of today. But definitely people feel a lot more with a modern day epidural, a light epidural, or walking epidural, whatever they're calling it where you are. And people can respond more, but it's definitely a dulled sensation. It is not the intensity, the sensation of an unmedicated person, right? It's different. So sometimes they need a little bit of coaching. So what if someone needs a little bit of coaching? How can you help coach them to still trust their instincts and to feel things and to do what's right for them? Well, here's what I like to suggest. Have you ever seen those oh, great, dog's barking now in the middle of my video, right? Have you ever seen those weightlifters and they take a really, really big heavy weight, and when they lift it up, they go, you know, why do they do that? They let a little bit of air off the top. They do it to help contract their abdominal muscles, right? And so there's not an overabundance of pressure in their lung capacity, because that's just too much pressure in here, right? So what's the difference if I go, if you do that and you feel the contraction of your muscles, and what I feel is I feel the contraction of my muscles here up high. And of course I see it in my face, you see it. But what if I go like this? What happens? Do that. The contraction of my abdominals is down low. It's down here instead of up here, right? And there's no tension in my face when I do that. Right? It's still closed glottis, but it is redirects the pushing. It bulges the perineum. What do we want for pushing? We want to bulge the pubococcygeal muscle, that figure 8 muscle that surrounds the urethra and the anus. And that's why a lot of nurses and midwives say, push like you have to have a bowel movement, because yes, it is the pubococcygeal muscle. But the next time you're going to the washroom, I want you to alternate between pushing like you have to pee faster and pushing like you have to poop. It's the same muscle, but you have control over those two parts independently. And if we could help people learn that concept of pushing like you have to pee faster, so bulging more from the front than from the back. And what we also don't want, and many of us are just starting to learn, and you know, in the last maybe 5 years where pelvic floor physiotherapy has become more popular, we've seen a lot of clients. I've gone to pelvic floor physio just to understand what they teach and, you know, what I could learn to help better understand this for myself as a doula and support my clients. But that the majority of us do not have weak pelvic floors. The majority of us have hypertonic pelvic floors, too tight, right? And so what people need to learn how to do is how to release the pelvic floor. That thing where we used to say, do a bunch of Kegels when you're pregnant, doing a bunch of Kegels when you're pregnant is typically not going to be the answer for helping you push better, right? You need to learn how to release and relax. There are parts of our pelvic floor that are going to need more strengthening and parts that are going to need more relaxation, right? And maybe sometimes there's a room there for perineal massage, which is going to have to be a whole other topic. Okay, so we want to teach people how to let that little bit of air off the top, so that if they're going to birth in a place where that coached pushing is very common, that we're giving them an alternative. We're giving them some guidance around a way to do it better. I want you to explore that yourself as a doula. Notice the sensation, the tightening of your abdominals as you take that little big bear and hold it at the top, and how that differs from when you let a little bit of air off the top. Explore that for yourself, because it will help you to learn how to teach that better to your clients. And I think you're going to notice a really big shift and the outcome in the second stage. I hope that was helpful. Love your feedback. Please go ahead and share your comments in the chat below, and I will post a bunch of links with some of the evidence to the things that I've talked about today. Take care, everybody.